Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome back for another Altaro Dojo webinar. So happy to see you guys. We got a lot of great content for you here today. And yeah, I've got Carsten Rachfahl with me. How's it going, my friend?
I'm fine. Hi, Andy. How are you?
Good, good. You know, I hope I said your name right. I always question myself when I say it. I think I got it right?
Yes, you got it right. In Germany, we pronounce it a little bit harder. It's Rachfahl, but it's hard for an American to use that sounds right. Okay,
Right.
Rachfahl is okay.
Good. I'm glad I was at least close. So, well, hey, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge today. We got a lot of great stuff to get to and just a ton of content. So I'm just going to kind of dive right in here. First thing I want to do is just talk about our agenda for the day. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do some introductions of myself, Carsten, Hornet Security, which we're the sponsor of today's webinar. And then we're going to get into kind of the two key areas that we're going to talk about in terms of the content today. So first thing we're going to focus on is what are the key Azure Stack HCI concepts? So when we think about hybrid cloud in the Microsoft world, Azure Stack HCI is kind of the new product that's at the focus of that, right? And so we're going to talk about what the key concepts are, what it is, how it compares to some of the other products in the stack, where it fits, that type of stuff. And then we're going to pass things over to Carsten, and we're going to talk about Azure Stack HCI in the real world. And Carsten's got a ton of great content specifically on this. You know, he's going to talk about installations, going to talk about storage, networking. We're going to talk about a couple of real world scenarios as well. Because if you're like me, it works best to see an example of how this fits inside of the real world. And then we're going to wrap up with some Q&A at the end of the session, along with some additional resources for you to take with you. Now, quick thing about the Q&A. As your questions come up, as we're presenting the content, feel free to get them into the Q&A form in GoToWebinar. If we can kind of stop and organically cover any of the questions as we go throughout the content, we will. But otherwise, like I said, we will be having a Q&A section at the end of the webinar today. And as is quite commonly the case, if we don't get to all of the questions, we will be doing a follow-up podcast, which I'll have a URL to that later in the slide deck. And we'll also be doing a written blog post that contains a list of the questions and their associated answers. So if you do ask a question today that doesn't get answered, we'll be sure to get you an answer in one way, shape, or form. So with that, quick introductions. Again, my name is Andy Syrewicze. I'm a technical evangelist for Hornet Security. So most commonly, you see me associated with Altaro Software. So Altaro Software is part of the Hornet Security Group. So if you logged into this webinar expecting to see the Altaro logos and you're wondering, hey, where's this Hornet Security logo coming from? That's why, right? Hornet Security or Altaro Software is part of the Hornet Security Group, and that's why you're seeing the lovely blue slide as opposed to the older white and orange slide deck. So with that, I am quite active out on Twitter. My apologies. You'll have to spell my last name at Syrewicze there. I also have a link to my GitHub profile, which is kind of what I use to be like the centralized location of all the different ways to get a hold of me if you have questions. And on top of that, I'm also a Microsoft MVP and a VMware vExpert as well. So with that, I'll pass things over to Carsten to talk about himself.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So my name is Carsten Rachfahl. I'm from Germany, good old Germany. So I'm a CEO of one of the two CEOs of the Rachfahl IT Solutions. There is the same name in it, so it's my and my wife's company. I'm self-employed for 31 years now, and my company is doing all the stuff I like: Hyper-V, Storage Spaces Direct, and Azure Stack HCI. So we are solely focused on that. We're not selling hardware, we're not selling software. We are an SI implementing these solutions, these Microsoft solutions, and training them. And also we have usually a conference every year, but now in the good old time where the virus is hindering us, we can't do that. So I have an online conference that I would like to mention. It's the Azure Stack HCI Days. It's a yearly conference online for free where we have a lot of Microsoft product managers talking about all the good stuff that is coming in Azure Stack HCI. And I'm planning the third one for this year around September, October timeframe. So if you are interested in that, there is the Azure Stack HCI Day.de website. The conference is in English. It's not in German, so look out for it. Great content. I'm also an MVP like Andy, but I'm not a vExpert, so I'm a double MVP. I'm an MVP for cloud and data center management. I always say the good old stuff on premise. There's everything in there, Hyper-V, storage bases, direct PowerShell, you name it. And I'm also an Azure MVP because I did a lot of stuff with Azure Stack Hub and now with Azure Stack HCI. So that's enough about me. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is HyperV Server. So this is not a Microsoft handle, that's mine. And this is why I have so many followers. They assume I'm Microsoft. I'm not.
I was going to say, you must have gotten right on that when Twitter came out pretty quick, I'm guessing.
I think it was 2011 or so, or maybe
Very
earlier.
cool. Gotcha. Well, thanks, Carsten. Appreciate you being here, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you in the session later. So from there, really quick introduction about Hornet Security. So we are the most comprehensive cloud security service for Microsoft 365. I mean, we do it all when it comes to security for your email and M365, spam filtering, email encryption, security and disclaimers, backup and recovery, which is the Altaro piece that you're used to listening to. You know, more specifically to today's topic, you know, over on the right-hand side of the screen, you see backup and recovery for VMware Hyper-V and in big bold letters, Azure Stack HCI. So I'm going to talk about that briefly a little bit later today. We do indeed do backup for Azure Stack HCI, along with all these other services that we provide on a day-to-day basis. We are a worldwide company, so you know, if you haven't heard of us, chances are we do have presence in your country in some way, shape, or form. We've got data centers all over the world, as well as offices. So we are an international company. In terms of you know, kind of where the company started and where we're going, so we really got our start back in the 2007, 2008 timeframe. Started with things like email encryption, email archival, and then, you know, fast forward to today, the company's been making a lot of strategic acquisitions, like the acquisition of Altaro and Zero Spam, to really kind of round out that product portfolio. That way, you know, we can worry about securing your environments. That way, you can focus on the stuff you need to focus on a day-to-day basis, right? And with that, let's get to our content today. So first thing I want to talk about really quick is just, you know, hybrid cloud in general, and more specifically hybrid cloud adoption. So recently we did a survey, but what I wanted to do before I show the survey results really quick is just pose a quick poll question to the audience. Is just to see, like, hey, where are you guys at with Azure Stack HCI? So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. Really just kind of see, how familiar are you with Azure Stack HCI? You know, do you know what it is? Have you read about it? Are you running it in the test lab? Just trying to see where people are at with it. Because I've got some interesting thoughts around the adoption metrics here that I'm going to share in a little bit. And Carsten, I don't know what your guess is here. I think most people are going to end up in either the I think I know what it is option, or I've read about it and that's about it. What are your thoughts?
I think that's true. Many of the audience, or the audience, is maybe more familiar with Storage Spaces Direct.
Yep.
That's a technology that is quite similar to Azure Stack HCI, and we will talk about that a little bit later. But Azure Stack HCI, it sounds like Azure, right? And many people don't think it's an on-premise solution. It's not in the cloud. So I assume most of the people heard about it, but don't have it installed or played around with it. Okay.
Yep, that's kind of exactly where I figured we would end up, is that, you know, people will be in either one of the first two options, and only 3% of respondents running it in production. So that doesn't surprise me. So I really appreciate your guys' insight on that. And let's switch to our recent survey data. So we did a recent survey. I think our sample size was over 1,000 actually, if I remember correctly. But we recently did a survey on, like, just the hybrid cloud. And the first thing that we talked about was, like, hey, you know, in terms of hybrid cloud and implementing hybrid cloud, what technical difficulties, if any, do you have with cloud technologies? And the number one most commonly responded item was technical know-how or certified staff. So this kind of lines up with the poll data that we just did, right? You know, where people, they've read about it, but they're not necessarily entirely up to speed on what Azure Stack HCI is. That reflects the same thing here with just general hybrid cloud technologies, right? So the other interesting piece of data here, when we talk about skilling and we talk about hybrid cloud, is that less than 6% of respondents reported no technical difficulties with cloud technology. So the flip side of that, 94% of people had technical difficulties with cloud technologies.
Yeah.
So not only are people struggling to get up to speed on it, people are having issues with it as well too. So if you have that feeling yourself, you're clearly not alone here. And then the other interesting piece of data that I wanted to share here that kind of ties in with our larger conversation today is that 2 in 3 IT professionals see the hybrid cloud as a destination and not a temporary state, right? You're always going to have those, and Carsten, I'm going to quote our good friend Didier Van Hoy here. You're always going to have those holy cows, right? Those holy cow workloads on premises. Not everything can be treated like cattle, right? So, yeah, it's pretty clear here. 2 in 3 IT professionals see the hybrid cloud as a destination. So there's always going to be some stuff on-prem. Now with that, let's talk about Azure Stack HCI, which, like I mentioned earlier, Azure Stack HCI is really that core piece of Microsoft's hybrid cloud story. And specifically, let's start with what it is, right? Because like you said it perfectly, Carsten, is like, I think a lot of people look at Azure Stack HCI and they just think it's some Azure thing, right? They just assume it's just some Azure thing because of the branding. And that couldn't be further from the truth. While there's a lot of hooks up into Azure and cloud services, really Azure Stack HCI is just built on all of those on-premises technologies that we've been using for all these years. So if you look at this diagram on the right-hand side, you look down at the bottom, starting at the bottom of this diagram, we've got validated partner hardware. So there's actually a website you can go to, and I'll have to get this into the Q&A post afterwards. But there's a website you can go to find, Azure Stack HCI validated hardware. You go and you grab that and bring it into your data center, and you install Azure Stack HCI on top of it. And really, all Azure Stack HCI at the OS level is just a combination of Hyper-V, storage spaces direct, and software-defined networking. Again, all the stuff we've been using in our data centers already. And then using that, it's created a platform that allows you to run things like virtual machines and, more interestingly, Azure Kubernetes service on top of Azure Stack HCI. And then in terms of management, you've got Windows Admin Center that you can use to manage it. Obviously, you can use PowerShell if you're a big PowerShell user. And like I've mentioned already, it's obviously got those hooks into Azure, and I'm going to be talking about that here on the next slide. The other key thing that I wanted to talk about here before I move on is that it really has an OpEx costing model. Whereas you think about how we've bought and purchased, a Windows Server all these years, Azure Stack HCI is priced, Carsten, correct me if I'm wrong, $10 USD per core per month, correct?
Correct.
Yep. So it does have an OpEx costing model as opposed to that large CapEx per purchase when you're, again, thinking how we have historically bought Windows Server. So, the big value here in Azure Stack HCI is obviously those cloud tie-ins, right? And what are they? What do you get by tying it into the cloud today? And really, it comes down to a couple of things. I already mentioned Azure Kubernetes Service. You can run that on top of Azure Stack HCI. And according to our other good friend, Ben Armstrong from Microsoft, Carsten, it runs in much the same way on premises as it does up in Azure. At least that's the goal that Microsoft has in mind with that. And then the other big thing on the Azure side is you've got what Microsoft calls Arc-enabled services. Mm-hmm. So Azure Arc is a service in Microsoft Azure that it basically creates a unified management plane inside of Microsoft Azure where your Azure Stack HCI solution just shows up as a resource in Arc inside of the public Azure cloud for you to manage and monitor and, conduct all of the stuff that you need to do with it right there from within Azure. So that's really one of the big benefits there is that you can control it from the Azure management plane. You've got things like ARM, you've got the other various tools and UXs like the Azure Portal, PowerShell, Azure CLI, and they're going to be building a lot of services on top of this. Now, the other thing that I see a lot of conversations happening about is this conversation of Azure Stack HCI versus Windows Server and what to use where, right? Because even today, I just got done talking about how Azure Stack HCI has Hyper-V, storage spaces direct, software-defined networking under the hood. I can go out and install, Windows Server 2022 and manually install all of those things myself, right? So, where is the separation here? Why use one over the other? And I went out to docs.microsoft.com just to see, like, okay, what's Microsoft's messaging around this particular question, right? And really what it comes down to is Azure Stack HCI is their preferred hyper-convergence infrastructure solution, right? So it gives you that hyper-converged infrastructure, again, that concept of storage and compute within the same physical chassis, however many nodes you have inside of that cluster, and then it adds on those cloud components, right, with the Azure portal and Azure Arc, like I just got done talking about. Windows Server, and I found this was interesting. I went out to, again, this docs link that I have at the bottom of the slide. This particular docs entry has the graphics have not been updated yet. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, they still have Windows Server 2019 in all of the graphics on this particular docs entry, but it does apply to Windows Server 2022 as well. You can still run Windows Server on bare metal. You can still run it in a virtual machine. I remember when they announced Windows Server 2022, one of the big taglines was, I forget exactly what it was, but it was something along the lines of the best operating system to run in the cloud, right? Is I think one of the taglines was. And I don't remember exactly where. I think it was at a Ignite session I watched a year or two back during one of the announcements. But anyway, you can also run Windows Server as a virtual machine on top of Azure Stack HCI. So those are kind of some of the delineations there. And if you want a little bit more information on that, highly suggest you check out the docs entry I have at the bottom of the slide. One other quick thing on the slide deck, you guys will be getting a copy of the slide deck, so don't feel like you have to quick jot down these URLs. You will be getting a copy of the slide deck later on. One of the final comparisons I wanted to do before we moved on to the more real world stuff was this comparison between Azure Stack HCI and Azure Stack Hub. Now, Azure Stack Hub is what we would have historically called Azure Stack, right? You remember a number of years ago, Microsoft came out with this concept of Azure, public Azure, in your data center, and they called it Azure Stack. Well, it's since been called Azure Stack Hub, not confusing at all, right? But what I wanted to do here is just kind of compare and contrast Azure Stack HCI with Azure Stack Hub. Now, Azure Stack HCI, as I said, hey, these are all the same technologies that we've been using all these years. It pulls in those Azure services via Arc. Your data center is connected to the Azure control plane through Azure Arc, and you've got that flexibility in hardware on premises. Now, conversely, on the Azure Stack Hub side, you need cloud native skills in order to be able to leverage that. So it's more like public Azure than it is these on-premises technologies we've been talking about. You've got those core Azure services in your data center. It's really intended for disconnected scenarios where you need the power of public Azure, but maybe you're on a cruise ship or an oil rig or something of that nature. The other really big difference here, with Azure Stack Hub, you're not just connected to the Azure control plane, you get your own instance of ARM in this particular case. So you get your own instance of Azure Resource Manager. So again, it's more natively like you're running public Azure, again, in your data center. And it comes as a highly integrated system from OEMs. You don't have that hardware flexibility. You go to Dell and say, hey, I want to run Azure Stack Hub. Hey, these are our options, and that's what you got, right? So in terms of advantages, like, okay, what do I get by running Azure Stack HCI as opposed to just running Windows Server 2022 or 2019, right? What do I get? Well, Azure Stack HCI has support for stretch clustering. And the other one I find really interesting here, and I think this might be a big selling point for some people, is with Azure Stack HCI, you do get extended security benefits all the way back to 2008. Carsten mentioned to me the other day. I was surprised by that, wasn't when we were talking about that. I just assumed 2008 R2, but I was really surprised when we go all the way back to 2008. Same thing with SQL 2008. You can also run Azure Virtual Desktop on top of Azure Stack HCI. You get thin provision volumes in S2D, direct device assignment and clustering, and Azure Kubernetes Service as well, as I mentioned earlier. So you can run those containerized workloads on premises. Now, Carsten, I think you're up to talk to us about Azure Stack HCI in the real world. So
let me share my screen.
Sure.
Do you see the right one with the slide?
I do see the slides, yep.
Okay, cool. So yeah, Andy, there are some more advantages. We only picked the most important ones, and Microsoft is Azure Stack HCI is a subscription model, so you get a new version every year, and you can use them, so that's very nice. And I double checked the information about the extended security updates. Windows Server 28 and 28.2 are supported until 2024, so another 2 years.
Nice.
And more important maybe is we have Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 are running out of the extended support next year. So there are, of course, a lot of people who are still on Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. And if you have those in VMs and you put those on Azure Stack HCI, you get 3 more years extended security updates. So you can run those VMs in your environment without fearing that there are security bugs in there that are not fixed.
Yep.
So, but
Carsten, real quick before you move on, we lost your webcam for some reason.
You lost my webcam. So
Yeah.
sorry for that. Is it back? Is it back?
It's
it is back.
back.
It's okay. Back. Sorry for that.
We wanted to see your smiling face.
So let's talk about Azure Stack HCI in the real world. I'm doing with my company, we have done hundreds of storage spaces direct implementations, many hundreds, and we are now also doing Azure Stack HCI. But to be fair, both are still implemented. So there are a lot of people doing Windows Server 2022 with storage spaces direct that maybe don't see the advantages that Azure Stack HCI gives them for their environment. So they still go with Windows Server 2022. And there are other people who see benefits in the features we were mentioned, for example, stretched cluster, that are going with Azure Stack HCI. So both are still valid and both are implemented. So let me see, I have to click here. I will cover some things via slide, or 1 or 2 slides, and most of the things I will show in demos. So we will see a quick video of the installation of Azure Stack HCI. This video is not with the latest Windows Admin Center. I did the video roughly a year ago, so there are some screens are in the new Windows Admin Center are a little bit in another order, but the technology is still the same. Then we talk a bit about the management. How do we manage Azure Stack HCI? And I will demo it. Networking is a very important part in a HCI environment because we don't have external storage like a SAN, where all our VMs talk over Fiber Channel or iSCSI with an external storage system. The storage is in the cluster. So we use local devices with storage spaces direct in Azure Stack HCI as our high available storage. So networking is very important here. We need a fast and reliable network for that, because the nodes have to talk to each other with a very high speed. So at least 2 times 10 gigabits. Even sometimes more. I will show a small benchmarking how performant Azure Stack HCI is, and then I will show a grand finale, and I will turn off 2 of 4 Azure Stack HCI nodes while workload is running. So I will switch off, or I will blue screen 2 nodes of a 4-node Azure Stack HCI cluster, and we will watch what happened. This is a demo that can go wrong, but I don't think so. And then we will talk about 2 customer scenarios. I worked on 2 different customer scenarios, why the customer decided for Azure Stack HCI. So let's dive into the video where we see the Azure Stack HCI installation. So here, this is Windows Admin Center, and in Windows Admin Center, I start the video. We have a scenario, a server cluster manager, where we can create an Azure Stack HCI cluster. And you see here, I just clicked on, let me go a little bit back. I just clicked on Azure Stack HCI. And when we do that, we have the option to install a cluster that is in one site. So every node is in the same rack, for example, or we can do a stretch cluster with two sides. These are two different scenarios. We will only look at the scenario where the cluster is in one side. I have also a presentation online in English where I talk about the stretch cluster. So now we have to authenticate ourselves, and we add the 4 nodes here. And this is a little bit faster. I can't type in so fast, so I speeded it up a bit. So now all the nodes are recognized, and we can go on, and they are already domain joined. And now the Azure Windows Admin Center checks if every software is on the nodes that we need. And here's already Hyper-V installed, and I installed the other components like BitLocker, datacenter bridging, failover clustering, everything on the nodes. And we need to reboot the nodes, so that will be later in the window. Now it will check if there are operating system updates that we can install. There are some, and I do that here. So we can also bring all our nodes on the actual level. Then with real hardware, in the next step, if the hardware vendor has an integrated system, that's important. So there are different validation options for Azure Stack HCI. There is an integrated system, and there is just a validated node. So if it's an integrated system, the OEM has to provide an add-in where you can update your firmware of the nodes and also the drivers. But of course, here I'm installing in virtual machines with nested virtualization, so there is no add-in for that. Yeah? So we skip that. This would be the solution update we see here. And now, because we installed some software parts that need a restart and also the updates, we can restart the nodes, and Admin Center will wait that all the 4 nodes come up again, and then we can continue with the next part with networking. Now we check how much network cards we have. I have here 5 on each node. I have 1 management NIC, I have 2 SMB NICs, and I have, this was a little bit too fast. Let me go back a little bit. So I have a management NIC, I have 2 SMB NICs, and 2 NICs for the Hyper-V switch, because Azure Stack HCI is always virtualization. Andy showed us we can put virtual machines on it and also Kubernetes. But also the Kubernetes cluster is also in virtual machines. So we have always the workload of Azure Stack HCI is VMs. Yeah? And for that, of course, we need a Hyper-V switch where the VM have connection then out of the cluster to the outside world. So now, I stepped back. Sorry for that. So we were around here, I would say. No, we were a little bit further. So here. Okay, here we were. So now I have to decide which adapter I will use for the management of the host, because we are working remote. Azure Stack HCI has only the core installation. So the installation with Admin Center is from another host, and we have to decide which network card will be the management card. Done that, he tested if they can connect to each other. And now I have to give every other NIC. So we have 4 NICs left of the 5, a unique IP address, so that Admin Center can check if the adapters can communicate with each other. That's very important. So we do a lot of checks before we install the cluster. And if you could look here under advanced, we can also use a different jumbo packet size. Now it's testing the connections, and if every adapter in every node can communicate with the adapter in the other nodes, we get a green light and we can continue with our setup. Now we have to decide which Hyper-V switch layout we do. I like the one in the middle, so 2 NICs for the Hyper-V switch and 2 NICs for the storage traffic. So the SMB1 and SMB2 are for the traffic between the nodes. We can also give the Hyper-V switch a different name. We can decide which load balancing algorithm. I leave it at the defaults, and I now click next. And this part is very long, so it will again test the connections. It will then go to the cluster validation, and before that it also created the Hyper-V switch on the nodes. So now it checked something in the cluster, and we can now press the validate cluster button, and it will check if the nodes are eligible to create a cluster. Let's put it that way. It takes a bit, so I also speeded it up 10 times, and hopefully everything is fine. We now can download a validation report and can watch. You see here we have some German. Yeah. So, but the validation report is in English. Everything is green here, so every test was successful, and we can go on and create the cluster. That's the next point. Everything is fine. So we go to next, and now we have to give the cluster a name. The cluster has a computer contour in the Active Directory. We still need Active Directory. Azure Stack HCI is not working with Azure Active Directory. So we give it an IP address. I don't like to use DHCP for clusters. So I give it a fixed IP address, and now we create the cluster. This will take also 2 to 3 minutes. And then we can go to the next step. If the cluster is there, we can create the storage. The storage spaces director software-defined storage layer is depending on the cluster. So we can only install the storage layer after the cluster is present. We see here I have 15 100 gigabyte disks in every node. We do now a storage validation. So we will, in essence, we'll look, are the drives the same? Do they support the needed features? Everything is fine here, of course. We can scroll through the validation, and if we click next, there is a button to enable the storage base stack. So now everything is done. It will create the software storage bus. It will create the pool. It will create the tiers, and it will even create one virtual disk that's called cluster performance history, where the cluster is collecting performance data. We will see that in the next demo. And now we are done. And this was a 20 to 30 minute process. I really densed it up to 6 minutes. Sorry if I was very fast, but I didn't want to stop and go forwards and stop and go forward, because then I clicked to the wrong place and we start again. So now we are here in the created cluster, and I can stop the demo. We will see that a bit later. And now I stopped the presentation. So now I have to go here to the next slide. Let's do it that way. That's always a problem. So yeah. So now tooling. You think Azure Stack HCI, Andy already told us, it's connected to Azure. It has to be connected to Azure because the billing is done through Azure. So the cluster has to connect to Azure at least every 30 days to tell Azure how many cores are in the nodes, and then you will be billed through your Azure subscription. But more than that, you don't have to do. You can integrate Azure monitoring, Azure security. Andy mentioned Arc. There are a lot of advantages if you do more from Azure, but you don't have to. Only the billing part you must do. So how can I manage Azure Stack HCI? You can manage it like every other Hyper-V cluster. It's still Hyper-V. So you can use, if you want to, Hyper-V Manager. Many of us like Hyper-V Manager. We are used to it. You can use it with Azure Stack HCI, no problem. You can use Failover Cluster Manager. We have a failover cluster, so you can still use the Failover Cluster Manager to use your to manage your Azure Stack HCI environment. You can use PowerShell, of course. You can do everything with PowerShell. It still is something that is running on premise. So we don't have the Azure PowerShell commandlets. We have the Hyper-V failover cluster storage commandlets that you also have with Storage Bases Direct, or even with a standard Hyper-V installation. And you can use Windows Admin Center. We will have a look at Windows Admin Center. That's the preferred tool that Microsoft is heavily developing to give us the possibility to do all the old management, Hyper-V, failover cluster, and all the new stuff. And if you have virtual machine manager, if you have system center, you also can use System Center, Virtual Machine Manager, and the other tools to manage your Azure Stack HCI cluster. So let's have a look to our demo. I have multiple hosts open here. So first, let me find my mouse. I will open Windows Admin Center. Windows Admin Center is a small MSI installation that you can install on a Windows Server or on a Windows 11 or Windows 10 machine. I have here Windows Server. So then it's installed in the gateway mode. So multiple users can use the Windows Server like a proxy to manage your environment. And I'm now on the host. I entered HTTPS localhost. Of course, I can use the host name, but here I used localhost. And when I click here at Windows Admin Center, I see all my systems that are configured in Windows Admin Center. And we look at this server clusters. These are 4 Azure Stack HCI nodes. There are AMD systems, an all NVMe cluster, and I have also GPUs in those systems. So if I go here and I start with the dashboard, I see a nice overview of my cluster. We have no alerts. It's connected to Azure, but it's out of sync. Not a problem. We see 4 servers. We have 24 drives. We have 105 virtual machines. 5 are running, 100 are offline. We have 6 volumes, and we have our CPU usage in the moment. The whole cluster use 4.3% of the CPUs in all 4 nodes. We have 24% of memory usage, and here we see our storage usage. And we also have nice graphs here. In the moment, they don't show anything. I think with the test I've done that I want to show you later, I destroyed my cluster performance history, but not a problem. We can restart it, and then we have nice graphs again. So here, when we look here, maybe I overdone it with the zooming it out. So now we see this is our capacity. I have 35 terabytes of drives, and depending how much resiliency I use, a 3-way mirror, for example, I could do a third of the capacity. So let's say 11 terabyte for volumes for virtual machines. And here you see my volumes. Here are the volume names. So you see I have some volumes here with some data in it. I would see latency and so on. Let's just do that. So Andy, I don't hope you kill me, but let me just fix this problem here. Stop cluster performance.
You're fine. It's always.
I still have some minutes, right?
Oh yeah, no, you're fine. You're fine on time. And besides, it's not a live demo without at least one curveball, right? So I mean,
yeah, it is, because I killed the cluster to test it, and I want to, if we would have a problem. So now the cluster performance history will be initiated again, and we will have nice graphs later. So let's go back to this site. So in essence, you see we have a nice HTML5 interface into the cluster. You see the disk just went away. We can go to these volumes, we can expand them, we can turn BitLocker on the volumes, we can turn on deduplication. So nice interface for all the features. Yeah, you don't have to go to PowerShell and do all the stuff. So this is a glimpse of management. Of course, there is a lot of more to show, but we don't have the time for that. So let's have a look at the storage. I told you it's very important to have a very fast storage system, and for that I will go back to to the console of one of the Azure Stack HCI hosts. And let me just type sconfig here. It's a core installation, so we don't have a GUI. So when you install Windows Server, you can install the full installation with the GUI experience or a core version. And Azure Stack HCI is always a core version. So the management on the console is very limited. In essence, we have PowerShell. I open Task Manager because Task Manager is still there. If I want to edit something, there's a good old Notepad. Yeah, you can edit files, but it's a bit old school, and the configuration is done with sconfig. And sconfig we know from Hyper-V server 2008. I think it was the first one with sconfig. So it's a management experience from the 90s, I would say. So ASCII-like, you choose a number and do something. But for most of the jobs, it's enough. So, and then here I have, of course, PowerShell. So when we look at the network, get net adapter, I see this host has many adapters. So here we have two Mellanox 100 gigabit NICs. We have two Broadcom 25 gigabit NICs. We have two more Mellanox 25 gigabit NICs, and we have even two Intel 1 gigabit NICs. So these servers have lots of network interfaces. You don't need so many. You can start only with two very performant network interfaces, but of course you can have more. And it's another 2-hour discussion what you all can do with different network designs. Maybe Andy and I will have a follow-up if that's interesting for you. So now I have a virtual machine here. So I go back to my host where I manage all this. Yeah, here we see the failover cluster manager, and here I have a virtual machine. And this virtual machine is called Benchmark VM. It has, I think it has 300 gigabytes of memory. Let's just have a look. Here you see memory 300 gigabytes. So I will move this virtual machine from one host, one Azure Stack HCI node to another. And I opened here the good old performance monitor where I show the RDMA counters. So you do yourself a favor if you use for your east-west traffic, so all the data that is flowing between the nodes, if you use RDMA-enabled network cards, because then you don't use CPU on your hosts to move data around. Yeah, you can also do it without RDMA cards, but then the data movement needs some of your cores. And if you don't want that, if you want to use your cores for your virtual machines, you do yourself a favor if you use RDMA cards. So unfortunately, in Task Manager, you don't see traffic when you do RDMA. It's not going through the kernel, it's going past the kernel, so you don't see it in Task Manager. You think, don't we have traffic? I will show you. So I will now move this virtual machine to another host, and I do that here. It's running on the node 1. Here we see the counter from node 1, and I will just move it to another host. And it will move 300 gigabytes of data to another host. So the movement starts if we are here at 52%. And you see now, if I zoom here, that we have a lot of data. And this is, you are from the US, you know, these are 8.3 gigabytes on this NIC. And here are another 8.3 gigabytes. So we are talking about 16.5 gigabytes per second. Times 8 is over 130 gigabits per second. So this 300 gigabyte VM was just moved from one node to another node in, I would say, 30 seconds. And that's amazing. No other hypervisor, as far as I know, and I can ask Andy, he is vExpert. I think VMware is not capable of that, or Microsoft is with RDMA. Would you agree
RDMA.
or not?
RDMA is...
I don't want to give you problems with VMware, so don't answer.
Yeah, It's my VMware. I haven't touched version 7 a whole lot lately, so I can't comment on that one.
Okay. Okay. So we have a very capable network between the nodes. The two 100 gigabit adapters were used, and if you do the calculation, we didn't use 200 gigabits, but yeah, you see now I'm starting a VM here, and I'm doing a lot of random I/O. So I do 8K, 50% read, 50% write, all random I/O in a VM, and we have nearly 100,000 IOPS. And you see here, we move 700, nearly 800 megabytes per second, full random. So that shows how performant Azure Stack HCI is. And I looked at the watch. We have only 15 minutes going on, so I have to speed up. I want to the grand finale, so I will start this 100 VM fleet VMs. Just start them. So Andy, I need another 2 to 4 minutes. I hope that's okay with the audience.
Oh yeah, yeah, you should be fine.
Okay. So now you see here, this is a watch cluster. That's a little PowerShell script that is getting all the I/O from the 4 nodes, and the 100 VMs I just started. There is disk speed in there, and disk speed is doing 5,000 IOPS here. I have it here, 5,000 IOPS per VM. I started 100, so we should see 500,000 IOPS here from these VMs. Yeah, and you see here our host, the task manager in our host, is very busy. So we are at 85% of CPU usage, and here you see 122. So if all the VMs are started, we are seeing roughly 500,000 VMs. And the important part is that we here see only around 1 millisecond. This host has some trouble here, so we are too high, 26 milliseconds. Usually that would work, but we have some time problems. So I will just let it run. You see, every host is doing a lot of I/O here, and I go back to my failover cluster manager. Yeah. No, I don't do that. Here we see all nodes, and we see all roles. They are running. So I prepared that on 2 nodes, I downloaded Not My Fault. So this is a nice tool from sysinternal, and it's for programmers to test some weird scenarios. And what we use it for, we will create a blue screen. So if we do a high IRQ fault kernel mode, that's an immediate blue screen. And I have installed it on 2 nodes. So this is a 4-node cluster, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I will blue screen 2 of them. So half of the hosts are gone while we are doing 500,000 IOPS and 105 VMs are running. So let me just do crash, and it will not ask me if it should crash. It will immediately crash. So crash, crash, and I forgot to start something here. So here is a PowerShell command. You see here in the watch cluster, the 2 nodes are gone already. We don't get any numbers from them. In the moment, we have a little bit PowerShell problems, VMI problems. And now, what's that? Reconnecting. Oh, it jumps back on the 4th node. Everything is fine. Here we are again. So 2 nodes are gone. We see all our volumes have problems. Yeah. Here you see every volume has problems. They are not complete anymore. We have repair jobs now. So when the nodes come back, there has to be some repair going on because there are still VMs running, writing data, and they can't update the extents, the disks on the missing nodes. So they have to remember that. And when the nodes are back, they have to repair them. You also see here are 12 NVMEs are not there anymore. But still, you see here, there are some VMs running. And if I go back to my failover cluster manager here, yeah, you see that the cluster is now starting VMs of nodes that were turned off or that had a blue screen, the cluster is now starting those VMs on the 2 hosts that are left. What's that? That's the 4 again, and this is the 3 again. They are now gone. Yeah. So you see here the other VMs. We have some problems to getting the information. If we give it a little bit, we can see what they are doing. But the other VMs that were gone with the blue screen are now starting on node 1 and 2 because node 3 and 4 are gone. And if we give it a little bit time that we unfortunately don't have, we could see how that all 100 VMs are running. And we see here we have now roughly 170,000 IOPS, and the other VMs are still starting. So they will pick up the traffic and run on the two nodes that are left. And when our other 2 nodes come back from the blue screen, so maybe we can have a look at the end of the presentation, they should start and they will join the cluster again and everything will be repaired, and then we can move the VMs back to the other host. There's also a balancer in the cluster that will do that, but we have a little bit of a time problem. So let's go back to the presentation. Let's talk quickly, I do it very quickly, about 2 customer scenarios. And then we will go to the wrap up and the questions, I hope. So I picked 2 customer implementations that I have done in the last month. One customer is a customer with stretched cluster. So stretched cluster is a scenario that is only supported in Azure Stack HCI. It's not available in storage spaces direct. And this customer has a real 24/7, 365-day IT has to run. They are a dairy, I think, and unfortunately, they get a lot of milk from the cows, and you can't tell the cows, so now stop giving milk for 2 days because we want to go to a holiday. So the cows don't understand that, and they give milk all the time. So they have really to work 365 days all the time. So everything at this customer is stretched. They need, if there is a disaster hitting one side, they must be able to work in, let's say, half an hour again with the data they had. And for that, the stretched cluster in Azure Stack HCI is really a scenario that is not available in storage spaces direct. We have an extra cost, but they are willing to do that. I have another customer that has an all cloud strategy. So they want to do everything that is possible in the cloud. I don't see a lot of customers who do that, but this customer really wants to do everything they have in the cloud. They also are an organization that have production plans, and a lot of them. So for some VMs or some workloads, they still need that is near to the production, because if you have something running in Azure, you have a latency of 20, 30, 40, 50 milliseconds. And imagine a production where you for example, watch pizzas. If every pizza has all the ingredients on top of it on something that is running through with a camera. If you do that from Azure, when Azure has decided if the pizza is good or not good, the pizza is gone, so you can't put it away. So you have some production workloads that has to be very near to the production. And for that, they have 4-node Azure Stack HCI clusters. But in this example, they do it switchless. So they don't have network switches. They use cables between the nodes to have the east-west traffic. They need a lot of cables. With 4 nodes, you need 12 connection cables. You have a lot of subnets, but that's for them. It's a cheaper way. They don't have to invest in 2 switches on 40 sites at least. So there are real world scenarios, different scenarios where Azure Stack HCI is the better choice. So that is wrapping up my part. Andy, you grab the screen again, please.
Yep, I think it is back to me. So make myself a presenter, and we're going to share PowerPoint again. You should see the slide deck again.
I do, yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, a lot of great information there, Carsten. Awesome demo. It's always fun to pull the plug on two hosts. All right. You force the blue screen live. It's always fun time. So really cool stuff.
I
Well, hey,
like a little bit excitement.
it is definitely. So, well, hey, I have one more slide here to cover, and then we've got some wrap up and Q&A. We'll probably go about 5 minutes over, just so we have some time to cover a couple of the questions. A lot of great questions coming in. Again, be sure to get those questions into the GoToWebinar form if you haven't asked it yet. And again, if we don't cover it during the session today, we'll be sure to cover it in our follow-up podcast and or our written blog post. So, to answer the overall question of this particular webinar, right? How is Azure Stack HCI forcing me to change, right? Because that's what the title of the webinar was. And really comes down to a couple of key things here. One is the removal of Hyper-V Server. Now, Hyper-V Server, again, funny naming convention issue here on the Microsoft side. Hyper-V Server is the free SKU of Hyper-V, and there's no direct replacement for it. Now, that said, Hyper-V Server 2019 is going to continue to be supported until what, 2028, I think.
2029 maybe.
Yeah, so you'll still be able to use it for a long time, but Microsoft has said in a couple of community threads out on the Microsoft community site that Azure Stack HCI is the new strategic direction for those people that historically used Hyper-V Server. On top of that, you also have this concept of the Azure edition of Windows Server 2022. You've got some features that are locked in that particular edition. You've got SMB over quick, you've got hot patching, and this is kind of I have to put an asterisk next to this bottom bullet point here. Only runs on Azure or in Azure Stack HCI, but Carsten and I were just talking yesterday, right, that it sounds like there's certain iterations of Windows Server you could run Azure Edition as well, right, Carsten?
Yeah, I have to double check it, but I talked to a Microsoft license expert, and he said if you have Data Center Edition plus Software Assurance license locally, you should be eligible to also use the Azure Edition on Azure Stack HCI. So there is the option to license it through the cloud per month with a fee for a core. Yeah.
Right.
So do like a data center subscription, but we are usually used to buy data center, and when you add software not software assurance to it, he said it's also okay to run the Azure edition on Azure Stack HCI. Yeah? So
Yep.
you can run it anyway on Azure and on Azure Stack HCI. Sorry, if you license it through the cloud. But he said there's also possibility to do it the good old way, buying Windows Server Data Center plus software assurance. But we have to double check that, and we will include the link in the follow up if yep. we have it. Okay.
So that's one of those key messaging points that hasn't been very clear this entire time Azure Stack HCI has been released, right? That's always been kind of a question is whether Azure Edition is only going to run on Azure Stack HCI or whether we'll be able to run it other ways. Obviously, you can run it inside of Azure, right? But yeah, the fact that they are
you can only have it on Azure Stack HCI, not on Storage Bases Direct.
Right. You can run it in public Azure as well.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Like that's just the fact that they're looking at these different licensing mechanisms around this particular flavor of Windows Server with these, that only this flavor of Windows Server has these features, right? It kind of shows you that, hey, they are changing their strategic direction. And again, it kind of lines up with that communities post I mentioned on pulling those features in, right? So, and the other fact is that Azure Stack HCI is here to stay. Again, I'm beating a dead horse here, but it is the new strategic direction, and you're likely to see a lot of the new features, for on-prem and hybrid cloud, targeting Azure Stack HCI specifically. If you want a little bit more background on some of these key points, I had 2 fantastic podcast episodes with Ben Armstrong from Microsoft. So historically, Ben owned Hyper-V at Microsoft. He was the Hyper-V guy for years and years and years and years. Now he focuses on AKS on-prem, but both of those episodes were just a wealth of information around this particular topic. So highly suggest you check both of those out. And we get to our wrap up and Q&A. So I want to wrap up with one more poll question here. And we always do use the second poll question on our webinars to kind of get an idea of how are you guys planning on using this technology with the strategy that, hey, based on your guys' feedback, we're going to go and create some content around these particular topic areas. So, hey, how are you planning on using Azure Stack HCI in the future? No plans? Or are you going to replace existing clusters? Or are you going to use it to introduce, hybrid cloud services in your organization? A couple of different options there. So feel free to respond to that. I'm going to leave that open for just another second for the sake of time. I'll give that another. Votes are still coming in. I have a hard time closing the poll while people are still voting, but for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and close it now. So just a real quick, so no plans to use it this time is, the majority, but a lot of people are looking at it from the standpoint of introducing hybrid cloud services into the organization. So that's kind of where I figured a lot of the people that would end up. And the no plans at this time, I'd be curious, just if you guys want to throw it, and you could even throw it in the questions form if you want, what's the particular reasoning behind not having any plans for it at this time? If I had to guess, most people are probably like in the middle, or they're nowhere near a hardware refresh cycle. That's probably a big part of it, but I'd be curious to hear what folks' feedback is on that. All right, so with that, a couple more slides here. So as I mentioned earlier, here at Hornet Security, we offer a number of different services, one of them being backup, and we do provide backup and recovery services for Azure Stack HCI, as well as Hyper-V and VMware-based virtual machines. So, super easy to use, highly powerful. You can do granular restores, full VM restores. We have replication as well. I'll have a link to that here in just a second. On top of that, we also have a number of different solutions that I kind of talked about earlier. We do all of the security services for Microsoft 365. We can also provide a lot of those same services for on-premises email servers, or if you're using like heck, even if you're using like a weird open source mail server or something like that, we can provide a lot of those same services. Another key piece of information I wanted to leave you with here is that we do, again, support backup and recovery for Azure Stack HCI. We actually put together a solution brief with Microsoft on our particular solution for backing up and recovering VMs on Azure Stack HCI. I've got a link to that down in the bottom of the slide here, and it'll give you all the nitty-gritty detail on exactly how our solution works with Azure Stack HCI, benefits, and all that good stuff. A couple of additional resources. We do have the Altaro Dojo, which you are, if you've watched one of our webinars before, you are no stranger to that. You can go to altaro.com/dojo. We have a number of different sections for you to check out: backup, DR, Hyper-V, VMware, M365, and additional sections coming in the future. On top of that, I also run a podcast called the Sysadmin Dojo Podcast, and if you're interested in checking that out, the URL is right there. Again, you'll get a copy of the slide deck, so don't feel like you have to quick and jot down the URL. And Carsten and I will be having an episode coming out next week that covers a lot of the questions that we didn't get to today. So be on the lookout for that. We also do a ton of ebooks on a regular basis. So a couple of our most frequent additions here, as we've got ebooks on Azure IaaS. I'm so used to saying Azure Infrastructure as a Service, but Azure IaaS, we have an updated ebook on that. We've got an ebook called the Backup Bible, which covers all things backup and recovery from a vendor agnostic point of view. And we also have a updated ebook on how to get the most out of Windows Admin Center, which Windows Admin Center is one of the tools that Carsten used during his particular demo today. So you can go and go out to altaro.com, and there's a resources drop down that you can go and find all these ebooks in case you're interested. Now, on to our questions. So I know we're a couple minutes over already. There's two questions I wanted to get to really quick, Carsten, that came up earlier. And the one question I kept seeing that kept coming up again and again is like, hey, how do I get started learning Azure Stack HCI for free? I actually pasted a link in the questions form that actually links out to the 60-day free trial of Azure Stack HCI. So you can run Azure Stack HCI for free for 60 days inside your organization. So be sure to check that out. The other question that came up, Carsten, maybe you know this. I don't know off the top of my head. Is it possible to run Azure Stack HCI on a single node? I mean, you could nest it inside of that single server, but on bare metal, could you run just a single node? I don't know the answer to that.
I'm not sure if I'm now putting my MVP award in danger, but there is
Oh no.
a one node Azure Stack HCI coming. And I think Cosmos Darwin talked about it already. So they are working, and you can already test it on a one node deployment. Of course, you can't move VMs around to another node, but as far as I assume, Microsoft is all in with Azure Stack for hardware. So they want to have Azure Stack HCI in every virtual machine implementation. So if you think Hyper-V, you should think Azure Stack HCI. At least that's Microsoft way of thinking. I'm not agreeing with that. I think Windows Server 2022 is still great for virtualization, as great as it was ever. And even storage spaces direct in Windows Server 2022 has a little bit more features than Windows Server 2019. But to be honest, 2019 is great for virtualization. There is not too much missing. Some parts are missing, of course, but you can do a perfectly fine implementation even with Windows Server 2019. Yeah. If you don't need the additional features from Azure Stack HCI, and they will add to them, I'm pretty sure there are amazing things coming. Think of Azure Virtual Desktop. You only scratched it, but you get the multi-user Windows 11 and multi-user Windows 10 edition for on-premises. That's nowhere you can run those except on Azure Stack HCI. And I know a lot of people went to Azure because of the Windows, how was it called? Windows Virtual Desktop or AVD, VVD or something like that. Now it's called Azure Virtual Desktop. So this is, I think this is a great thing. Another advantage, and I know we are over time, you get a very good, cheap support for Azure Stack HCI because it's an Azure product. The Azure support is responsible for supporting you, and with $100 a month, you get a professional support for your subscription. There can be one Azure Stack HCI cluster in that subscription. There can be 40. So for 40, imagine that. I have contact with Microsoft support already. These are people that are specially trained on Azure Stack HCI. It's not the general Azure support. People who know what they are talking about. And that's the cheapest offer I have ever seen for a Microsoft product. So there are a lot of advantages. But if you say, I'm happy with Windows Server, what I have in Windows Server 2022, fine. Install it on hardware and go with it. Completely fine with me.
Yeah, that's a great point you brought up about the support, because I mean, you think about how much just if you had to pay for a support incident out of pocket, what it would cost. Last I knew, it was $400 or $500 per support incident.
This is the basic support. They don't, if they fix your immediate problem, they fix your immediately problem maybe. But if you need a root cause analysis or so, they don't do that. Then you have to have a Unity contract, or before it was a premium support contract. It's now called Unity, and they start, I think, at $20,000 to $30,000 a year.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You compare that with $1,200 a year.
Yep.
And that's so. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up
cost. A lot of great questions, so we have to talk about them in the podcast.
Yep. Definitely. There's one other question I wanted to just finish up with, because I told the person who asked, I told them we would. It's funny you mentioned cost, and I've seen this question come up a couple of times in the chat, and that is Azure Stack HCI just the $10 per core per month, or are there additional costs on top of it? I think the only additional cost that I'm aware of would be if you wanted to add on some of the extra Azure services on top of it, right, Carsten?
Yeah, no. So if you have Azure Stack HCI and you put Linux VMs on it, that's all you pay. You pay your $10 per core, and then that's okay. If you do storage spaces direct with Linux, you have to license Windows Data Center for the host, because storage spaces direct is part of Windows Data Center. Even if the workload is not Windows Server, you have to license Data Center. With Azure Stack HCI, you go with the cores. If you put VDI hosts on it, There's no data center license included for you. You only have your Azure Stack HCI monthly costs and your VDA license, or Microsoft 365 and so on. But if you do Windows Server VMs, if you put Windows Server VMs on top of your Azure Stack HCI, it's like with every other virtualization, you have to license the Windows Server VMs.
Right.
They are not included in the $10 Azure Stack HCI. So you have to license your host with standard. You can do it with standard if you have only 4 VMs or so, or you do it with data center. Yeah, these are additional costs. That's in the $10 don't include the Windows Server VMs. You have to license them separately, and that's putting a lot of people off because they think it's included. It's not. You pay for. You have also software subscriptions. So Azure Stack HCI, the $10 include the new versions. Yeah, so you have like a software subscription included. I think, it's not too bad.
Yeah, that was the main reason I wanted to bring that particular question up, right? Is because that throws a lot of people. They think it's and Microsoft hasn't been really clear on this. They haven't been very clear on what exactly you're getting for that $10 per CPU core per month, right? So that's exactly why I wanted to bring it up. So thanks for clarifying that. With that, I think we're 10 minutes over on time, which is fine. We had a lot of great questions. Again, if you asked a question today that did not get answered, we will be sure to do we've got that follow-up podcast coming, as well as the written article. We'll be sure to get an answer to that sometime next week. So if you asked a question that didn't get an answer, we'll have an answer for you next week sometime. Other than that, Carsten, I want to say thanks for stopping in and sharing your knowledge. Your demos are always great, my friend. So always good to have you. We'll have to have you on for another one in the future.
I have always too much demos and too little time. So the cluster is already is healthy again. Everything is fine now. Okay, that's thanks, good. Andy, for having me. Was a nice webinar, and if we see each other or we hear each other next week in the podcast.
Yep, that sounds good. And everyone, thanks for watching. We hope to see you again for a future Hornet Security webinar. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.